First of all, I'd like to thank you for attending this World Parks Academy webinar training program. We'll begin in just a few minutes. I'd like to show you a few things about your screen so that you can more fully participate. First, I'd like you to, I'm not going to use the pointer because I found that the pointer kind of creates some problems. So I'm going to just refer to the various areas on the screen. What you see in the presentation area is a screenshot of your whole screen, and you can see it's kind of duplicated. First is the large space in the right. That's the presentation screen where your instructor will scroll through the appropriate slides during his lecture. The second, the screen in the upper left is where your instructor will be pictured during the presentation. I wonder if you could start your webcam now, Christy, so that people could see you there in Dublin.
Okay.
Thank you.
For some reason or another, my computer, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
My computer has gone to restart, which surprises me, but I can still see I'm in with you. Oh, I know, maybe it's, I know what it is, because I haven't moved something. It's fine, I'm back again. Start my webcam, okay.
Okay, and there you see Christy. The screen just below Christy there is the attendee list. This is where you'll see the names of all the people who are participating in this webinar and their role. You can see Christy and I are hosts. Fourth, just below that is the chat pod. That's at the lower right of your screen. This is where you can ask questions. All participants can see what you type here. And then finally, there's a long red arrow, and I'm just going to click the drop-down menu. Oh, my colleague has been able to make that work, the pointer work. So if we look at the long red arrow, and I put the drop-down menu, you can see that you can give feedback in a number of ways. You can also inform the instructor that you have a question, and you can type your question in the chat pod, and your instructor or I will answer. And Christy, if you'll confirm that you would like questions as you go along rather than holding them to the end, is that correct?
Yes, of course. At any time, stop me either if you want to speak or if you want to just send a question. And I'll probably ask you a few questions too. And you have a choice of using the tick box or the cross, the white cross on the red circle from that drop-down menu.
Different options in the chat bar there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to your instructor, Dr. Christy Boylan. Christy will be making this presentation from Dublin, Ireland. He has a long career in parks and recreation and is currently the chair of the Board of Regents of the World Parks Academy, your sponsor for this free webinar. Close that. Please remain after he completes his presentation for a brief evaluation and your instructions on how to receive continuing education units for your participation here today. Thank you, and now over to Dr. Christy Boylan.
Well, hello everybody. While Monica is putting up the presentation, the first slide of it, I'd like to say hello to you all. And can I just ask, Alan, are you also in the US? We have 3 people in the US, Florida, Philadelphia, and where was the other one? So just, I presume you are all in the US. We did this on the 10th of February. And oh, you're from Ohio, very good. But you're in Spain currently. Oh, very good, very good. Well, this presentation will last at least 90 minutes, and I apologize if it's too long, but I hope that I'll make it interesting enough to keep your attention. And it's because it's going to go back in history and bring you up to the present time that it will take that length of time. And Monica will be putting up a recording of one of these presentations We did one on the 10th and then this one today. Whichever one has been recorded to the best satisfaction, she'll be putting it available for yourselves and others who may like to tune into it afterwards. This is the outline of the presentation, and by the way, please let me know if you can hear me okay. I realize that my accent will be different from what you're used to, so if you have any issues, if you want me to go slower or if you want me to go faster, equally you can let me know. But if you're not clear about anything I've said, by all means either send me a chat or raise your hand. If you go up to the top to the little indication at the top, you can use the drop down menu to send me some signal. I would probably ask you a question or two as we go through it, because some of you may have experience of some of these places. This will be essentially about Europe. There will be a small reference to the USA, but it will be essentially about Europe, and because that's where many things started. Of course, the ships that sailed across the oceans were started in Europe. Okay, the outline, we'll start in the ancient period and then we'll look at some of the private parks in the UK, because they were for their kings and so on, and they were never intended for the public until someone realized, well, they could do that as well. And then in the 18th century, there was this whole landscape design change happening, where there was formal design change into informal design, which is generally known as the English landscape style, but indeed which in reality was very much influenced by Chinese design of gardens. So then the 19th century was the period when public parks were starting, and we'll go through the reasons for those. And then we'll bring it down. All of this will be mainly through UK, because that's perhaps where I'm most familiar with, but it doesn't mean it was the only place it happened. As we'll find out, in some places they were more advanced than the UK, but the UK is probably the place where it's best known. And then we'll talk about some parks in other European cities. I have been fortunate to have travelled quite a bit around Europe and indeed around other parts of the world, and visited many of these places, and I'm quite familiar with them, which is a help. The presentation will end with cemeteries, and war cemeteries included in that, because they are also part of our parks and recreation visits that we like to take. So we start off then. More than 3,000 years ago, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria boasted of parks in which he planted trees brought back from conquered countries. Now this was not just a useful piece of information about parks, but it's useful to know that there was an emphasis on trees in that period as well. But parks were attached to palace grounds as places for hunting, assemblies and celebrations. Now the word park means to hunt, so you have to remember that they were never intended as places for the public to have a walk. They were originally hunting grounds. The Persians called their parks Paradisia, which actually gives you the word paradise, and it has remained ever since. Unger Great Park is from the medieval period, and it's the oldest known park in England. And you'll find in different countries that there are different records going back various times, one of which is the Domesday Book, which was a recording made of all the assets, we'd say. You could call this asset management today. And in England, and these were 31 parks were recorded, all properties of the monarch. So there's a little note there at the bottom about the Domesday Book, commissioned in 1085 by William the Conqueror, who in fact was a Viking, and he invaded England in 1066. And it was completed in 1086 and contained records of 13,418 settlements in the English counties south of the River Ribble and Tees. You'll find that this is referred to, if you read any English history, the Domesday Book is a very useful reference. So now we jump to the 13th century to the middle of the 17th century. There's not much happening in this period, but for some reason or another a license was required to build a park. But then remember, parks were private. There were aesthetic open spaces owned by kings, bishops and abbots. It's interesting that bishops and abbots are added in here because the religious societies had a nobility and they were as powerful as the kings. So parks were enclosed with a bank and a fence, and the word pale was used to define the boundaries. Now if you look there to the right hand side, you see this little area in red, and I've just put the little arrow on it, and it shows you that the pale is the name of this area, and it's down here. This is a map of Ireland, and the pale was an area around the east of Britain, the central east of Britain. And while Ireland was invaded by the British back in the 11th century, and for 800 years they lived there, during the period of the Pale, they only lived in this little period on the east coast. So it was the part of England that was directly under the control of the English government in the late Middle Ages. And on the deaths of both William I and Henry I, their parks were routed by the people and nearly all the game lost. You see, they didn't have any appreciation for these areas. So that was vandalism, you might say, at the time. Now that little reference that I have down there, Susan Lasdon, a book she wrote in 1991, the last slide will have a page of several references, including that one for you, if you wish to follow up on those details. In the 16th century, park making was soon to become so widespread that a commission was set up to inquire into the number of new parks and the enlargement of old ones, and the peasantry found themselves without means of livelihood as their lands taken were behind the park pale. So the parks became part of the status of nobility. And in Hampton Court in 1524, Cardinal Wolsey, he enclosed an area and he walled 750 acres. But you know, there's a lesson here, and it happens again and again, that you should never have more than your boss. And King Henry VIII, you see his image here, was in control of England at the time, and he didn't like the fact that Cardinal Wolsey had this property, so he took it from him and he developed it for his own purposes. So, but King Henry VIII also developed in 1538 grounds around the palace at Nonsuch in Surrey. Now in 1536 to 39, the monasteries were dissolved by King Henry VIII, because remember, this is the period of the Reformation, because he couldn't get the Vatican to approve his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He set about setting up the Protestant religion, and Martin Luther in Germany was another person in that movement as well. So he decided these monasteries were not good, so he dissolved them and distributed 60% of the land among some of his clients. So if you travel through England, and indeed if you travel through Ireland, you see quite a number of these ruins, that such as this one at Whitby Abbey, where they took the roof off them and they left them to the elements of weather and hunted the people out of it. So the other thing that happened, where they were living, if there was no park there, they built parks elsewhere, and then they built hunting lodges with them. So Henry VIII's focus was on hunting, and that's why you have so many royal parks in London. For example, in 1532, St. James's Park was established, and in 1536, he acquired several manors to create Hyde Park. These people had power to do what they wanted. And a map by Christopher Saxton between 1575 and 1580 showed that there were 1,870 parks scattered throughout England at that time. And then there was an emergence of an emphasis on health. It's interesting that this happened so far ago because we're still looking at this idea of health being important. Walking became popular not just in parks but also in towns. And during the Civil War in England, the fences of parks were broken, timber, trees, woods and all the deer destroyed, and lands were converted into arable or pasture. We don't often hear about the Civil War in England, but it happened between 1642 and 1651, and there were a series of armed conflicts between the parliamentarians and the royalists, and this was something that Oliver Cromwell was involved with. And after the Civil War, some nobility enclosed lands, including villages, for parkland, and of course this gave rise to conflicts. The locals had no say over their territory where they lived. Remember, at that time there was nobody had title to lands. This is an interesting little fact. People lived, their forefathers lived for times and property, but they had no documentation. The English were the people who brought in this documentation. When they confiscated properties, they drew up maps showing them. So we mentioned already about some parks being developed by kings. Well, James I enlarged Bushy Park, but he reduced the size of other parks. The problem was getting revenue, you see, to run these things. There was no government funding. And Charles I enclosed 2,000 acres for Richmond Park for hunting, and this was not seen as a good idea because he displaced so many people. Richmond Park is a very large park in London and still is today one of the biggest parks over there. And Charles I was beheaded by Cromwell, and this is one of the reasons that he fell out of favour, because he was looking after himself. In 1625 they had a plague in London because of overcrowded conditions and unsanitary conditions. But Charles I had set up Hyde Park in 1630s, and in 1646 Parliament took over the Crown lands and sold some of it to raise revenue, and some such as Hyde Park were bought back later. So they didn't want to have royalty at that period, and they felt if they didn't have royalty, well, they wouldn't have needed for these parks for them. So near Birmingham, Bishop John Vesey promoted the idea of parks being a public venue, and Queen Elizabeth I, you see, these parks were being used for military reviews, and they were essentially private functions for the royalty. So Queen Elizabeth allowed spectators to go into Hyde Park, and this led to the gradual admittance of the public to royal parks. So we'll move on to the next one then. During the Restoration, the campaign to plant trees was due to an introduction of coal, and it saved the last of the trees in England. Remember, trees were being used for energy, for burning fires and so on, for warming houses, until they discovered the use of coal. But we have a noted gardener, John Evelyn, who lived from 1620 to 1706, and he was a writer of note, and he supported the idea of planting trees. And in Greenwich Park, Charles II arranged for 6,000 trees to be planted in 1664. Charles II was the son of Charles I, and he had fled to France when his father was executed. So when the Civil War was over, he was allowed back under new arrangements. So the redevelopment of estates included tree planting, and then the names became park. People started adding the word park to it. So following the restoration of Charles II, which we mentioned a while ago, to the throne in 1660, he redesigned and then opened up St. James's Park to the public. And together with Hyde Park, which had been opened in 1637, they became popular public spaces. But the royal parks remained walled until well into the 19th century, and so access could be restricted. But John Claudius Loudon led a campaign for the gradual replacement of walls with railings, and that was done in 1828. Now, this idea of railings, I know in America, many of your parks have no boundaries at all, but we find in this part of the world that a park needs a defined boundary to make it clear that you can't drive in with a car or have any unlawful access. And this is quite an important part of our psyche here. Other royal parks were open to the public after much political pressure, such as Green Park in 1826 and Regent's Park in 1835. Now, that little reference by Louise Wickham at the bottom, it's a very interesting book because she focuses on the political advantages of developing gardens and parks. We don't think about that too much, but there were political reasons for them. Where I live in Dublin, we have the Phoenix Park, and the Phoenix Park is the largest enclosed urban park in Europe. And the word that defines it is enclosed. There's a wall all around it, and the wall was built during the middle of the 19th century as a job creation exercise because we had famine because of the failure of the potato crop during that period, and some public works were being done to provide employment. Charles II was the person who approved that the Phoenix Park would be seen as a royal park, and that was in 1662. So you're looking at 354 years ago that this was a royal park. So it's much earlier than many, many other parks throughout Europe. But of course, it wasn't intended to be a park for the public. It was a park for the King's deputy. Ireland was part of the European, it's now part of the European Union, but it was part of Britain at the time. And the King lived in this park in a fine house. You can see the gates of it there in the top of the gates entering the park. And you can see the actual house down here. Now, that house was designed by James Hoban. And for your information, James Hoban was the architect of the White House in Washington, D.C. So we have a connection there with the architect. So this park is 700 hectares. It's very large. In fact, it's 4 times the size of the state of Monaco. And that's a very famous place, as you know. So this is one of our oldest parks in Dublin. And here's some information about it here. It was opened then in the public by 1747. Lord Chesterfield opened it to the public. So here we have a public park open to the public for at least 100 years before other parks around the UK were being opened to the public. The biggest monument that you see here is an obelisk which was built for the memory of the Duke of Wellington, who was from Dublin, and he was the one who defeated Napoleon, and he became later Prime Minister of England. And it's sitting here, as you can see in this image, in the Phoenix Park. You can see the Phoenix Park is spread out throughout. So it fits in quite well. The other thing to notice here are the fallow deer. There's a herd of 300 fallow deer in the park, and they're quite used to people, so you can go reasonably close and take a picture of them. There's no hunting allowed, of course. The deer were brought in originally for hunting for the Lord Deputy, but they're not used for that anymore. Then this is an image of a guy called Decimus Burton, who was an architect and employed by the Crown in England, and he made a huge impact on the Phoenix Park. It's he who made many of the design changes in there. And it's only 3 kilometers from the city centre, and we'll show you another image later to get you the idea of that. In fact, here it is. So the Phoenix Park, as you can see, is this area here, and this is Dublin City. This was meant to be the outer ring road, this blue line, but it's no longer that. It's now the inner ring road because Dublin has expanded way out beyond it. But I want to draw your attention to this insert image. This is the Phoenix Park, this white blob, way back in 1800. And Dublin at that time was the second city of the empire, of the British Empire. But there's the size it was, that little purple blob. And you can see the Phoenix Park was even bigger. And now, of course, the Phoenix Park is small compared with the city. So this is how changes over time have made an impact on it. Now, by the way, if you need to ask me any question, just do so. Can I ask you, how many of you have been to Dublin? There's 4 of you there, so you might, if you want to go up to the right and take the drop down and give me a little, or you can type, whichever you like. Oh, Elizabeth, hello, how are you doing? My friend Elizabeth from France. Thanks for tuning in. Alan, you've been to Dublin, not you, Joanna, okay. And who else? Lynn and Paula. Have you been to Dublin? I know Elizabeth has. Elizabeth was here last year. Okay, so Lynn, you haven't been either. Yes. Hi, Elizabeth. And now, well, that's a place for you to go and visit. So we'll move on now from Dublin, and we'll move to the general idea of what parks were for. Parks were for retreat, for recreation, for refreshment. And town walks proliferated, and soon residential schemes around parks were seen as attracting funds for development of the park. And we'll give you some examples of those later. You can see Bushy Park down in the bottom there. So the 18th century was an era of triumph for the park. As garden designs were becoming less rigid, so too were the controls on people. Landscape paintings gave rise to the use of the word landscape for parks and gardens. So the change from formal to informal gardens, regarded as the new thinking, was reflected in Lord Carlisle's park at Castle Howard. Now that's what the images there are, Castle Howard. John Vanbrugh transformed the grounds into a vast, irregular, highly contoured Elysium, complete with temples, obelisks, and each on a hill. Now, in that process, he destroyed the village of Henderskelp. And again, remember, these people were the law of the land, and nobody would dare challenge them. So, because they had the power. Public access to the royal parks was a privilege granted by the monarch, and keys were issued. In the case of St. James's Park, there were 6,500 keys issued to the people who surrounded the park, so they could actually come and open the gate and go into the park. And John Nash was a famous architect in the UK, and he had plans in 1828 for a royal public park, which is to make a change. It was a royal park before, but now he's going to make it a royal public park. And you can see a little note there about Charles II. He had St. James's Park remodeled in the latest style to turn it into a place where he could mingle engagingly with his subjects. So Charles is therefore more intimately connected with that park than any other great personage. And as London grew, the pressure for public access grew, and residential schemes near these parks were expensive. Walls formed the boundaries and were gradually replaced by railings due to pressure from J.C. Loudon, as we mentioned earlier on. Hyde Park was railed in 1828, and by 1868 the last walls were down. Now, George II's daughter, Princess Amelia, tried to close Richmond Park, which you can see in the image here. Remember, we said it's about 2,000 acres. So she was kind of going backwards in 1841. And when she asked what it would take to close the park, she was answered a crown. And that meant, of course, it would be a revolt against the royalty. So in 1811, there was an Act of Parliament passed for a scheme at Regent's Park. It was intended to be a public park, but in reality it was a commercial venture, residential development with the exclusion of the public. Now we have similar schemes today which operate with golf courses, where somebody gets a site to build a big golf course, and on the surrounds of it to build housing estates, and each of the people who buy a house there can have membership of the golf club. So that's been relatively successful here in many cases. But this idea was a new concept at that time, but it succeeded very well, and it was repeated elsewhere, and it also gave rise to streetscape planning, such as the Royal Mile, and that's in Edinburgh, and the Garden City movement, which I'll be talking about in a little while, and that came some decades later. the precedent was set that parks should be part of town planning. And in 1838, pressure was forced on the commissioners for woods and forests to open it to the public. So this was the gradual movement of it. This is another image of Dublin, and I want to draw your attention to the Phoenix Park, which you saw earlier, and this white item here is the Wellington Memorial, and I forgot to mention that it's the second tallest in the world, the tallest being the Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you can see this area here at the center of Dublin. It doesn't have much greenery, but it has quite a number of trees, since they don't show so much on that image. And but I want to draw your attention to these little squares, this one and this one and this one and this one. Now, this one here is a public park, but it was originally for a festival. This one here is St. Stephen's Green. It's one of Dublin's oldest parks. It goes back to 1663, and it's about 20 acres in size. And this one here is an old park as well, but its period comes from the 1800s. And all the people living around here had keys to get into this until it was actually given over to the city. The Archbishop of Dublin wanted to build a cathedral on it, and he gave up the idea. Over here on the left-hand side, we have today a private park, and the residents here have keys of it. So we still have these various ideas from times past that are still existing here. And this is during the 18th and early 19th century, parks are provided within cities for the private use of residents in surrounding squares. So increased use of London's royal parks brought about an awareness of the need for more public parks. Victoria Park and Battersea Park became public, and municipal parks were thought to alleviate chaos generated by rapid industrialization and a rising population. They were seen as providing improved environments that would help reduce the incidence of cholera and other diseases. And in 1801, the population, this is of England, not just London, England was 9 million, and it increased to 14 million in 1831. And that was a 40% increase, but this increase was mostly in urban areas. So this is one reason why parks came to be. And the public parks movement came with the Industrial Revolution. This was during the Victorian period in England, when Queen Victoria was on the throne, and she was so for over 70 years. And they were motivated by a desire to improve the physical conditions and the spiritual well-being of the workers. And you see, they started, in fact, a lot of this was down to the cotton industry, where they were bringing in cotton from the eastern part of the United States and indeed the Caribbean, and they were making cotton out of what you call the actual piece that they were bringing in, but they had to refine it, let's say, and they had very poor working conditions, long days, and many of them. The only day they were allowed off was Sunday, because there was a kind of a religious tone about it. And you can see the image that's there. It may be easy to see, but it's showing that they had children and they abused everybody to make them work, and people didn't live very long. So if you look on the right hand side, for example, you see the average life expectancy of professional tradespeople. The lowest was in Bolton at 34. Imagine the average life expectancy at 34. And in Liverpool, the labourers are what we regard as unskilled, and the average life expectancy was 15. Remember, children worked in those days, and they could be working for 6 years at that stage. So it was a terrible time for people. So the Victorians felt that if the workers were in better health, they would be more productive. Now, do you see the line here? It wasn't that they could maybe be better for themselves. They were looking at it from their own point of view, to get more production out of them. And they felt if parks were available, a man would walk with his family, be well dressed, and it would reduce his time in the pub. It seems during the 19th century Drinking in pubs was a huge problem. Alcoholism was a huge problem. So Victorian parks were intended to be a mechanism to bring about socially desirable forms of behaviour. And the development was done by landowners and builders without planning controls. There was no such thing as planning controls that time, and there was no local government. Central government did not interfere in local issues, and central government in many cases was very preoccupied with issues of war. And the landlords who owned these various estates, they essentially controlled what was going on in the areas. And industrial wastelands grew without provision of basic services or open spaces. So debt rates in towns and cities were higher than in rural areas. And they said in Manchester, for example, that the best society of Manchester were trying to get out of it. This gave a hint that the best places to live were not in the cities that were beginning to build, but in rural areas. And working classes had to live near the factories because there's no such thing as public transport at the time. And they worked long hours, they had little free time and a poor standard of accommodation. So there was a rise in crime, there was social unrest and outbreaks of disease. And of course disease would be epidemical, and when it would be an epidemic, it was harder to control. So you can see at the bottom I have Public Health Act 1848. That was a big trigger towards getting parks established. So in the face of increasing urbanization and the lack of any public green spaces in many areas, two men took up the cause. One was a politician and the other was a garden designer and a writer. And while each had their own agenda, together they provided the impetus for the campaign for urban public parks. Robert Slaney was a Whig who was first elected in 1826 as an MP for Shrewsbury, and 2 years earlier he published an essay on the beneficial direction of rural expenditure, and he set out a case on the advantage derived from public walks and gardens. So this was the beginning of somebody recognizing the value. And Jeremy Bentham had written a theory of utilitarianism, and it had influenced Robert Slaney and his view on public parks' importance in benefiting society as a whole. So there was this urgent need for open spaces for exercise and walks, and it was identified, and we've already mentioned Robert Slaney and John Loudon and Jeremy Bentham, and they used, you could say they lobbied for a way of providing open spaces for the common man to walk on. J.C. Loudon, who was the garden writer, he reported on the superiority of open spaces and walks in cities in continental Europe. Some of these things were actually happening in continental Europe. And Humphrey Repton, who was a famous landscape designer, in 1826, he began campaigning for new public parks. And it was said that parks in Paris, as developed by Napoleon, was accessible by the public, including the Jardin des Plantes. Now, Elizabeth, excuse my pronunciation there, the greatest botanical garden in Europe at the time, and it was open to the public, whereas entry to Kew Gardens in London was by appointment, and indeed today you have to pay to go into Kew Gardens. Kew Gardens are about 120 hectares in size. Similar examples in Germany were noted, and they were developed in accordance with the English landscape style. So these people were developing parks and designing them in the way that the English gardens were designed. So John Claudius Loudon had no doubt influenced Slaney, and he published an article about the management of London squares and their importance to the health of its inhabitants. And that was in 1803. And you remember I showed you a slide of Dublin, and those parks that I showed you were squares as well, and they were provided at that time and before. So in the first edition of Encyclopedia of Gardening, Loudon discusses public parks specifically for the first time, noting that they are valuable appendages to large cities. But he bemoaned the fact that our continental neighbours have hitherto excelled us in this department of gardening, almost every town of consequence having promenades for its citizens. And he wrote breeding places for the metropolis in his new publication, The Gardener's Magazine, which the idea of circular promenade was developed into an extremely far-sighted greenbelt proposal for London. So Loudon's campaign for public parks, particularly in London, was taken up by the politicians, and this led to the creation of Victoria Park and others. By contrast, in England, several parks and gardens suffered vandalism. Kensington Gardens, for example, the plants and flowers were removed and there was graffiti on the walls. The need for the public to be educated to respect public property was noted. And in Potsdam, Lenne, a designer there, he said that English parks were for game, not humans, because they didn't have walks in it, which reflects the fact that they were for hunting. But oftentimes people recognised that parks were the lungs of London, which was then becoming a very built-up city. So in J.C. Loudon's Gardener's Magazine, he proposed a series of green belts about a half a mile wide in concentric rings, and it sowed the seeds for green belts of the future. This man, John Claudius Loudon, was a Scottish botanist, a garden designer and cemetery designer, an author and a garden magazine editor. What we find in this whole area of garden history is that the Scottish people played a major role. Many of them were designers and many of them were plant hunters and so on. Now, moving on a little bit, in 1832, Victoria Park in Bath was a private initiative by John Arthur Roebuck, a member of Parliament, and between 1829 and 1830. And it was about 12 acres, and it was the first public park to be funded by public subscription. Now, that's a milestone I have to show, because remember we looked at royal parks up to this, where the royals were really for themselves and then they let the public in. But in developing new parks, there was no legislation, there was no facility for governments to cater for that. So this guy, Arthur Roebuck, decided to raise funding. So it was public subscription, not a private donation. And he had his aim was, the chief incentive was the economic value for tourism and a philanthropic desire for recreational facilities. Now, we mentioned Robert Slaney earlier, who acted on Loudon's advice, and he urged an inquiry to be established for the provision of public open space, and this inquiry was known as the Select Committee on Public Walks, and he became its chair, and they proposed areas for walks and recreation, but they didn't use the term parks. But by 1839, Parliament had sympathy but could not agree on funding. They realised, of course, that to provide these things was going to mean they'd have to raise more taxes. So the 1848 Act, which was the Public Health Act, enabled municipal authorities to buy land for parks, which was the first of its kind. So they felt that a more sustainable alternative was needed, and few public walks that existed initially provided the model. And in 1833, Slaney argued for this review, which he set himself up as chairman of the Select Committee, which I've already mentioned. And his arguments for the committee centred on the massive expansion in the urban population and a wealth that these urban workers would generate. And the assumption was if money was spent on improving their lives, then all would benefit from a growing economy. So in 1836, there was an amendment made to the Common Fields Enclosure Act that provided enclosure of any open or common field within 10 miles of the city of London, and those near to other towns and cities containing more than 2,000 inhabitants. So this is a little image here of the Downs in Bristol, which is an open area, a commons area, and these are common in cities in the UK where there's no boundaries on them, and initially there were places where locals had a right to do what they wanted in them, but they finally became part of the public parks. And the following year it was agreed that all enclosure bills provision for open space sufficient for the purpose of exercise and recreation. And as a result, the commons on the edge of town started to be enclosed as public parks. For example, in Southampton, they then had a series of parks laid out from 1846. Now, Bath we've already mentioned in 1830, but the land there was leased. It's not owned by the local authority, and visitors were charged entry. But then there was another Victoria Park. There was a lot of Victoria Parks, by the way, in the 19th century because Queen Victoria was the Queen. But this one in Bethnal Green, London, was the first new public park funded by the state, which would be the government. And it was a direct result of the recommendation of the Select Committee, which we've already mentioned. And the London Democratic Association that organised the petition to the Queen. So they found £1,000, and they did so by selling some royal property. York House in 1841 was sold, and used the money to build Victoria Park. So it's a question of converting property of the royals for the value of the public. So some other little parks that were developed in 1833, there was a new industrial town established, and they created a municipal park called Moore Park in Preston. About 100 acres, and the plan was drawn up by the town steward, and it's named Phillip Park. Then we're back to John Claudius Loudon, because he continued the approach of Humphrey Repton, who became Sir Humphrey Repton. And he established the design theory of garden-esque. You may read about this if you've done some landscape design, you'll be aware of garden-esque. And attention was given to the individual plant and placement in the best conditions for them to grow to their potential. So here we have, in a place called Derby, the mayor of Derby, his name was Joseph Strout, so he engaged J.C. Loudon, the image you see from above, to design an arboretum, and he provided this at his own expense for public use. You have to remember the circumstances at the time. The New World, like the United States and indeed Australia and other places, there was ships bringing plants back from these places, and they needed places to grow them and see what they were like. So an arboretum was one area that was decided for woody plants, which is basically trees, and they would grow all these. So J.C. Loudon did a design for this, and this was opened on the 16th of September 1840, but there was no maintenance budget because the city of Derby had no authority to use taxes to maintain it. So they put in an admission fee in there. So it's interesting how these things came about. Now this man, J.C. Loudon, also set down rules for how you should design an arboretum. And he, by the way, Chatsworth was the first arboretum in England, and Derby was the second. So he held that they should contain both foreign and native trees, and they should be established in all towns for people to learn about them. So the income generated did not match the required expenditure, and in many ways his gift to the city of Derby caused a problem as the local authority could not use the rates to maintain it. Now the interesting, this is an image of Derby which I took some years ago. Both these pictures are ones I was there about twice, and you can see that the trees are planted on mounds, and it accentuates the design, and the pathways are a little sinuous, so it makes it more interesting to get around. Other parks developed around that time was Prince's Park in Liverpool, and in 1842 Richard Vaughan undertook a speculative development such as Regent's Park, and he commissioned Joseph Paxton to design what he named Prince's Park. Joseph Paxton is a person we're going to be hearing more about in a little while. He was a very famous designer of the 19th century. And the park was for the exclusive use of the surrounding villas, occupants, and they paid a rent for its maintenance. So you can see this is another one on the model of Regent's Park. And in 1918, Liverpool Corporation, which is the municipal authority, took Prince's Park in charge. So from all those years, for about 60 years, maybe 80 years almost, this park was private, and then it became a public park. Now, they petitioned to the Queen in 1840 and pleas to Parliament were signed by 30,000 people. Amazing to get 30,000 people to put a petition together for public parks. It would be difficult to do it even now. In 1841, the British Parliament voted £10,000 to promote the opening of public parks to municipal authorities, and that the authorities would have to provide matching funding. But this wasn't an awful lot of money, because a cost of setting up and maintaining the parks would be about £100,000. So in 1841 there were 77 additional parks, public walks, in the process of formation. And then the options to exchange Crown land for parks development were considered, and York House, as we've mentioned already, was sold for the establishment of Victoria Park on Bethnal Green. And Victoria Park became the first royal park developed for public use. Remember, the public were allowed into other parks, but this is the first time it was decided that they would develop it for public use. And in 1846, there was an act provided that empowered the Commissioners for Woods and Forests with a funding of £2,000 to form a park in Battersea. Now, Battersea Park is a very famous park in London, and I'll mention a little more about it in a few moments. But this was its beginning. Now, it is resulted from this 1846 Act, which allowed the purchase of land, and between 46 and 64, the work was done on the construction. Sir James Pennetorn and John Gibson, and it was opened in 1858. But the trouble was, this was a very, very famous park and a heritage park, and during the 70s and 80s, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of the UK, and she got rid of a lot of direct labour teams within local authorities. So the work was put out to contract. Contractors were in a hurry to do the work. They didn't look at standards too much. So Battersea Park declined, and I was there when it was in decline, and you can see an old picture of mine on the left, and then I went back again when it was redeveloped, and that's my pictures on the right. So the trouble about this, it's a heritage park, and because of that it qualified for funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. That's the lottery, you know, where you buy tickets to win money in a draw, and that's what they use that funding for heritage purposes. So they provided 11 million, there should be an M after the 11 there, and the park is now fully restored. Now they restored it to what it was when it was first developed. So it meant that any changes that happened in between were all removed. So it was quite an exhaustive thing. I mightn't have agreed personally with some of these changes, because some of the things that happened in between were good and looked well. But one of the most famous parks in the UK is Birkenhead Park. And this is very close to Liverpool. And this is the first park to be publicly funded. This is the difference now. Remember, the other ones were private donations or public subscriptions or sale of royal properties or some such like. But this was publicly funded by the taxpayer in the Liverpool area. Birkenhead, it's a dormitory of Liverpool. And it resulted from an Act of 1843 passed by the government, which allowed a loan of £60,000 to the authorities to purchase 226 acres, about less than, or a little more than half of which would be for the park. The rest would be some buildings on the Regent's Park model. But this time this was to be a public park. So they got Joseph Paxton to design it, and it was called then the People's Park. And it was designed on the basis of the English landscape style, and I have to say that the English landscape style was influenced. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth, I see you've written a note. It was in the middle of the 19th century, the squares were developed with Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, Elizabeth, I will be coming to that too, indeed. I have some slides about that too. Thank you for that note. This park had influences of the English landscape style, which was also the style of Chinese gardens, believe it or not. And this guy called Frederick Law Olmsted, and I'm sure our American participants are well aware of who Frederick Law Olmsted was. He visited there in 1850 and he was very much impressed, and he then applied his design for the design of a Central Park in New York. Now, this is another park that suffered because of the compulsory competitive tendering that went on in the UK. And when I visited there some time ago, I saw this sort of vandalism, seats being broken, and places didn't look very well. So this didn't work out too well. So they actually got money from 11.3 million pounds from the Heritage Lottery Fund in 2004, and this park, as the other one was totally restored to what it was when it was first opened. So if you want to visit a historic park, well, then you can see that one too. And now Elizabeth has given us another note about the emerald necklace. Yes, that was also Frederick Law Olmsted, and that was in Boston. And that I would cover if we were doing the American parks, but this one is totally on European parks. So then in Manchester in 1844, 111 local dignitaries initiated the voluntary subscription scheme and raised £26,701 by the year end, and it was used for Phillips Park, Queen's Park and Peel Park. Now we see another set of legislation brought in here, the Public Health Act of 1875, and London, by the way, had a separate Metropolitan Local Management Act. London was remember, we didn't have local authorities at this stage, we had government legislation, and London had its own really. So, but the issue of maintenance cost was addressed through this act, and it empowered local bodies to develop and maintain parks, but it did not apply to Scotland or Ireland. But however, by one means or another, by the end of the 19th century, there was 150 to 200 public parks provided. A little bit about Joseph Paxton, already mentioned here. Joseph Paxton, he became important after the death of J.C. Loudon, and he was a head gardener to the 6th Duke of Devonshire, who owned Chatsworth Garden, which I mentioned earlier on. And in 1842, he designed Prince's Park in Liverpool, which we already mentioned. He also designed Birkenhead Park, already mentioned. And then other ones he designed was Kelvin Grove and Queen's Park, Glasgow, the Crystal Palace in London, which is one of his most famous designs, for which he actually got his Sir Joseph Paxton for. An image here of the People's Park in Halifax, and then you have two more there in Dundee and Dunfermline. But the formal terrace became a characteristic of his designs, as were lakes, raised mounds around the boundary, which made the park less visible from the outside. And he influenced others who trained with him. Another famous person at the time was Thomas Mawson, a landscape architect from 1861 to 1933. And he was the leading figure in park design from 1890 to 1933. And he also had many writings and lectures. And he set up a company in the Lake District, which is northern England. And he was the first president of the Institute of Landscape Architects in the UK. And Hanley Park, Stoke-on-Trent, was opened in 1898 by his design. In 1850, there were two acts of Parliament which stimulated benefactors to donate parks for public use during the 1860s and 1870s. And in Sheffield, the Duke of Norfolk provided 50 acres for a public park. The Calthorpes of Birmingham and the Seftons of Liverpool all donated parks that perpetuated their name. Remember, this was the period when people could still donate and get their name on something. Some of the individual organisations that were set up was the Commons Preservation Society, and they succeeded in saving Epping Forest in Essex, where there's 6,000 acres of ancient woodland. So there was all sorts of different things happen. Now I'm finished with the UK, and I'm now going to travel across through other countries in Europe, and I'm going to start in Croatia, which is over on the eastern part of Europe. And the reason I've included this park is because it was opened in 1794, before all this public park movement in the UK. Now I know we've Phoenix Park opened in 1747, but this was an initiative of Bishop Maximilian Roebuck of Zagreb. I can't pronounce it properly, I know. And it was the first large public park in southeastern Europe, and it predates the majority of Europe's public parks. So this bishop had the idea of building a park for the public, way back before the UK got going on it. And it's known as Maximer Park, called after him, and at that time the park was located on the outskirts of the city, although today, of course, like many places such as the Phoenix Park in Dublin, it is surrounded by many of the city's neighbourhoods, and it was formerly a dense forest of hornbeams and oaks, and the remainder of the original forest survives as it is girded to the park. The area in total is about 1,005 acres. Now I was there in 2012, and I was very, very impressed. Now, Elizabeth, we're back to a little bit about France here. Napoleon spent considerable time between his military campaign and the development of Paris, and when he come back from the military battles, he would spend time going around Paris, and he had plans for the development of Paris. And features included the Arc de Carrousel and the Arc de Triomphe, and he also transformed gardens, making changes at the Great Garden of the Luxembourg Palace, including replacing walls with railings and forming a grand entrance. Now, the references I have here are from a book by Maurice Guérini, who wrote in 1970. It's entitled Napoleon in Paris. It doesn't talk about his battles, it talks about how he was involved and how he had such an interest in the building of Paris. And there's 30 years of history there. I found it a very, very interesting book. Other parks, Park Monceau, Napoleon wrote, the great city needs another good garden, and he advocated a garden in Chinese style. Remember, we're getting to be familiar with the Chinese designs. And he promoted the idea of an open space between the Louvre and the Tuileries, and remarked that there was a great shortage of parks in Paris. Fascinating stuff, considering he had so many other things on his mind. Now we're coming to the information mentioned by Elizabeth, where Napoleon III, remember there was no Napoleon II, because Napoleon III was a nephew of Napoleon I. And when he came into power, he got this guy, the Baron George Eugene Haussmann, and it is he who built up quite a bit of Paris, as Elizabeth has already mentioned. He dramatically re-envisioned Paris at the request of Napoleon III, and the Emperor had spent several years in London, and that capital's superior technical infrastructure inspired him to change Paris's urban landscape. And Napoleon III wanted to change the essentially medieval city of Paris into a modern capital with wide streets, large parks, and updated sewage systems, and to accommodate new modes of transportation. It's interesting that they were looking at, throughout Europe, they were looking at cities not being able to accommodate the growing population and the new modes of transportation. The narrow streets were not attractive to them anymore, whereas from a tourism point of view today, narrow streets are very, very attractive. Now, the large-scale developments of Paris by Haussmann in the 1850s and the 1860s would have been unthinkable in any British city. They weren't on the same wavelength, it seems. So the J.C. Alphand had been laying out the parks as part of this plan, and they included the Bois de Boulogne, Le Bout Chaumont, and Parc Montsouris, and again, Elizabeth, my apologies for my pronunciation. Edouard André, his landscape architect, introduced these principles of parks designs to Britain when he won the competition to design Sefton Park in Liverpool. So you can see an overlap then of people from one country to another. Going down to Lyon, we have the Parc de la Cité d'Or, which is said to be the largest urban park in France at 117 hectares. And its origin goes back to 1856 when the land was bought from the Hospices Civils de Lyon. And in 1866, work began under the leadership of Eugene and Dennis Boulher, who were both Swiss landscape designers. In 1857, it was opened, but the work wasn't completed. And at that time, the Jardin de Botanique de Lyon, which 8 hectares, was described as France's largest municipal botanical garden. Now, inset in the pictures here, we've Daniel Boulin, who is the manager of the parks of Lyon. And last year, he had the World Rose Convention there. You can see he's quite a few roses in it. There's some very interesting glass houses, and you can see an image of the park. So this is a very fine park if you go to Lyon. Then if you want to go to Spain, if you go to Madrid, you have the Buen Retiro Park, which is the Park of the Pleasant Retreat, one of the largest parks of the city of Madrid, and it's about 350 acres, which is about 140 hectares, we'll say. It belonged to the Spanish monarchy until 1868 and then became a public park because at that time they were getting rid of the royalty in Spain. Queen Isabella was overthrown. And the large artificial pond is a very interesting feature in the middle of the park. They have a monument to King Alfonso XII featuring a semicircular colonnade and the equestrian statue on top of a tall central core. They also have band performances here, and I can tell you that the echo across the water in the park from the band is very, very interesting. But if you go to Barcelona, you'll find that there's some very, very interesting parks, and I must say very unusual parks, because they were designed by Antoni Gaudí, who was an architect, and he built many interesting buildings in Barcelona, one of which is the Sagrada Familia, the cathedral, which he died, or he was killed in a motor accident or a traffic accident before it was finished. But I believe it's now finished, and you can go and visit it, and it's very, very interesting. So the park well, he has these interesting designs of little shelters and steps and walls and seating, as you can see, the serpentine bench on the left-hand side. And he has also these colourful ceramic tiles on the walls, which add great colour to it. Now, for those of you familiar with English, we have this term gaudy, which is for something that is probably over the top on design. And that word comes from Antoni Gaudí. That's the word Gaudi or Gaudi, and Elizabeth testifies that it's a beautiful park. I'm sure you know it well. Now we move to Portugal, and they have a park in Lisbon called the Edward VII Park, and this is Lisbon's largest central park, named after Britain's Edward VII, who visited the city in 1903. He followed Queen Victoria, who died in 1901, and they reaffirmed the Anglo-Portuguese alliance. Now, I find it amazing that Portugal called park after an English king. Elizabeth, you've mentioned Gaudi. Is that the proper spelling? I have Giudi. I must check it out. I'll check it out. 62 acres with neatly clipped box hedging flanked by mosaic patterned walkways and stretches uphill from the Marc de Pombal Square to the Belvedere at the top. Big attractions here are the two estufas, the hothouse and the greenhouse, filled with tropical plants. It's interesting that in Lisbon this is what they did. Now we move up to the Scandinavia, and in Malmo they have the first large park to be established in Malmo, is known as Kungsparken, and it was opened in 1872 by the Swedish King Oscar II, and it was designed by a Danish man, Ove, I think they call that, and designed, and it took inspiration, look, from the English landscape gardens again. It's filled with flowers, rare trees, and shady avenues, and in the style of the time, an artificial grotto was constructed, and it still survives today. The person in the picture here is Ulla Mellin, and he is what they call the city gardener, which is essentially what we call the director of parks. In Copenhagen, they have Tivoli Gardens, which is a famous amusement park, which goes back to 1843, the oldest amusement park in the world. This is not free to the public; you must pay to use it. So it's, but it's interesting. The Tivoli is, you find the word Tivoli around in different places in Spain and so on, and it's Tivoli Gardens were famous gardens in ancient periods. In Copenhagen, then, they have the King's Garden, dates from 1606, the oldest public park in Copenhagen with more than 2.5 million visitors. And Rosenborg Castle is at the heart of the park, and there's many tree-lined walkways, and it's home to the famous statue of Hans Christian Andersen, of which I'm sure you have heard. But one of the most interesting parks that I know, and most unusual, what other words can I use? It would be one that you would not find anywhere else in the world. This is Vigeland Park in Oslo. And this is called after Gustav Vigeland, who was a sculptor who died in 1943. And he also taught other people the sculpture, and he used full life-size images, if not even bigger. And in 1928, the Oslo municipality accepted his proposal for a park. And work began in 1931 and even continued after his death. It's 32 hectares, it's got 192 sculptures with more than 600 full-size figures. Now, Alan, do you need to, you want me to open your mic? You want to say something? They're having some problems with the internet connection. Will it be available to view? Yes, it will be recorded, and you'll be able to log in afterwards. And as far as I know, it may be the same site. Or Monica can advise. If you're there, Monica, you might just let him know. But yes, it will be available afterwards. You have been. Yes, go ahead, Monica. It will be on the World Parks Academy website. Okay. Elizabeth, you said the Versailles of Oslo. Well, I didn't hear it expressed as that before, but it's not anything of the same as Versailles. It's spectacular, but not in the same way, in my view. But okay, so we go to the next slide then. These are some images which I took, and it was a very wet day. That's fine, Alan, don't worry about it. It was a very wet day, so you can see the water streaming down the bodies. It's quite fantastic. And then you can go into the museum and you can see the same sculptures indoors. So different material, I'm sure, but this must be a very amazing school of art. Now we move on to Helsinki, and there's a Central Park in Helsinki. From 1914, the City Council approved the plan by Berthold Young, 1,000 hectares, an excellent representative of the rich and varied nature in the southern coastal area of Finland. It's Helsinki's, then Kaivo Puisto Park is Helsinki's oldest and best known park, and is surrounded by embassies and villas. And then there's an observatory at the highest part. This is Elina Numi, who is the manager of the parks in Helsinki. Another park in Helsinki is, and I won't pronounce it properly, is Tatsadurvorni. You need a Finnish person to give that proper pronunciation. But it was their first municipal park, and it takes its name from the observatory on top of the hill. It was Svante Olsen's first task as the city gardener of Helsinki. Completed in 1904, it's considered to be one of the oldest or the most important achievements and one of Finland's most significant historical city parks. So then there were changes made in the 1890s. It was designed in the German landscape park style at the time, which included curving paths, broad expanses of lawns, and so on. So that's the famous park in Helsinki. Elizabeth, you've written SYS. Is there is it reference to a slide or something? Or see you soon. Oh God, I never saw that before. Okay. Now the Esplanade has been Helsinki's, thank you for joining us, has been Helsinki's premier park for 200 years. And in the past people would come to Espoo to see and be seen in the promenade, and now people sprawl on the grass, meet friends and enjoy some treats from their picnic basket. So there's a little bit of detail there, which it's again Svante Olsen. I'm not going to go through the detail. It will be available for you to, if you wish to pursue that as well. Well, we're going now to Budapest, and I have to tell you I'm flying out to Budapest on Friday for a meeting on Saturday. Been to Budapest a few times, it's got some lovely parks, and of course Budapest is a combination of two cities, Buda and Pest. The Városliget is the largest park in Budapest, originally a swamp, and the first trees and walkways were established in 1751. And in the first decades of the 19th century, the park was created in the English landscape style, and it became the first public park in the world, they say. But we know that that's not the case. That's taken from their site, Visit Budapest. So there's some images of it there. But a more interesting place, in my view, is the Margaret Island in Budapest. The River Danube flows through, and if you go to Budapest, I would certainly advise that you take the trip, which allows you to go down the Danube at night. All the important buildings are floodlit, and they play lovely music, and there's a commentary on the buildings. It's certainly one of my things that I remember from years past. This is a little park in the middle of the River Danube. You can see in the bottom image the island, and you cross a bridge here and you go into the park, and you can come to another bridge and leave, or go in both ways. It's 2.5 kilometers long, 500 meters wide, and it's in the middle of the Danube, and it was dominated by nunnery churches and cloisters until the 16th century, and declared a public garden in 1908. Now, we brought a group of our staff when I was working with South Dublin County Council here to visit. We always went to a different city every year, and we visited there in 2003, and of course they got me to hug this tree to show it was a lovely, lovely tree. The island is mostly covered by landscape parks and is a popular recreational area. Its medieval ruins are reminders of its importance in the Middle Ages as a religious centre. In Brussels then, which is the political capital, we might say, of the European Union, they have some very nice parks. This one is associated with the Royal Palace, and it's the Parliament, and the US Embassy is also around here. This was created in 1776 and 1783 on the site of the gardens of the former Kudenberg Palace. And you can see it's a lovely walk to go around. There's nice big wide walks, pleasant established trees. So that's some pictures I took in 2002. Vondel Park is the largest city park in Amsterdam, and it's the most famous park in the Netherlands, and it gets about 10 million visitors every year. Its origins go back to 1864 when a committee was established to found a public park to raise money to get about 8 hectares, and the landscape architect Jan David Soka was commissioned to design it in what was then the English landscape style. Remember, this is amazing how the Europeans took to this very much. And this same man, the Soka family, father and son, also designed the Keukenhof and other parks in the Netherlands. The Keukenhof was a famous park for bulbous plants in the springtime. So anyway, the name Vondel Park was adopted when a statue of a Dutch poet was situated into the park, and then it was enlarged to its current area of 45 hectares in 1877. Very nice park in Amsterdam. Moving into Germany, in Hamburg, there's a park, quite an interesting historical park called Stadtpark. Stadt meaning the city park, I suppose. 148 hectares, which is a large park, and in the borough of the northern part of Hamburg. And it's the largest park in the city. Now, Hamburg has very nice parks right in the middle of the city, and the goes a ribbon through the city, and they're very, very attractive. But this one is actually in the northern section. They're regarded as the city's green heart, even though it's 3 kilometers off the city centre. And the largest parks in the city centre are the Plantenum Blumen and the Alster Park, which I mentioned those earlier on. The most famous landmark in this Stadtpark is the Planetarium, which you can see on the right-hand side, which was a former water tower. And if you go there at night, it's illuminated in various colours. Now, the picture on the left isn't very clear, but it shows 2 ladies from Hamburg holding up an old plan showing you the views, the layout of the park from its origins way back, many, many years back. But this was occupied by the German army during the war, and a lot of damage was done in that period. Going into Berlin, there's the Volkspark in Friedrichshain in Berlin, originally conceived by Peter Joseph Lenne. We mentioned him earlier on when we talked about parks not being good for humans, he said in England. In 1840, the Berlin City Council decided to construct it on the occasion of the centennial of Frederick the Great's ascension to the Prussian throne. So the oldest parts of the park were laid out in 1846 to 48 and based on plans by Johann Heinrich Gustav Meyer, who was a landscape architect, and he held the post of City Parks Director, and he learned his craft in Schönberg. The park was constructed on the space of a former vineyard and officially opened in 1848 with an area of 46 hectares. So it had been hilly only since the late 1940s, when wartime debris was piled up here to create 2 mountains. You know, this is something that's done. We did it in Dublin. They blew up a big monument here to Nelson, and we just went into a park and made a bit of a hole and put all the stuff in there and then covered it over. So now we have a mound that people can walk up and look around the city from. Who has been in Berlin, can I find out? Joanna and Lynn and Paula. Alan's gone, I think, yeah. Oh, you haven't? Okay. Well, if you go to Berlin, this image that you see in the middle is the Brandenburg Gate. And you have, Elizabeth, good. Brandenburg Gate is the famous icon of the city of Berlin, and it's right beside the Tiergarten, which were former private hunting grounds of Frederick Wilhelm, they call him, I think. In the early 19th century, the original designs were by, again, Peter Joseph Lenne, and they're still of the same today. Now, there's quite a lot of forests, as you can see in these images. But he was commissioned to transform the green area into a landscape park and a zoological garden on the southwestern edge of the Tiergarten, which was opened in 1844. Excuse me. So if you go to Berlin, you'll be going to the Brandenburg Gate, and then you can go and see the park right beside it. Turin then is a very interesting city in northern Italy, and Paolo Odone, whose image you see here in the top, he's retired now, but he was the director of parks in Turin for many years. This one is on raised ground, Valentino Park, and is flanked by the west bank of the River Po in between the Isabella Bridge and the Umberto Bridge. It was once a hunting ground, look at the same idea as we mentioned before, and in 1864 a French landscape architect redesigned it. But this was opened in 1630 as the city's first public garden. So here we have, this is a record for Europe, 1630, first public garden. Moving on to Milan, the public gardens were first established between 1857 and 1862 and were designed by Giuseppe Balzaretto as a green town district, and it's a typical botanically rich English garden. So here you have Parco Forlanini, you have Parco Sempione, and you have Giardino della Villa Comunale. So these are some of the parks that you can get in Milan. Back to Dublin, to Ireland, we have the oldest city park is St. Stephen's Green. Originally this was a marshy common, remember we mentioned the word common, as an open area on the edge of Dublin, because Dublin was very small way back then, and it was used for grazing and enclosed with a wall. And much of the present-day landscape of the squares comprises modern buildings, some in a replica Georgian style. That would be from George III, from the end of the 18th century, and relatively little survives from the 18th and 19th century. But in 1814, control of the green passed to the commissioners for the local householders. Again, remember, this is a place where people had their keys. And access to the green was restricted to the local residents. And then in 1877, Sir A.E. Guinness, who was Lord Ardilaun, and he was from the family of the Guinness Brewery fame, and this is an image of him here on the left-hand side. He bought out the lands from the commissioners for the local householders, and he paid to get it redeveloped as a typical Victorian park, and then he gave it over to the nation, originally to the city, but then to the nation. So St. Stephen's Green is still in the layout it was when he first developed it. It was reopened in 1880 and is 9 hectares in Victorian layout. It's a very, very popular city park in Dublin, and if you want to see how Victoriana treated their parks, it's a very useful place to study from that point of view. Pathways are plentiful, and of course there's loads of sculptures in the place, and a children's playground was added in later years. It was designed by William Broderick Thomas, who was an Englishman, and he also designed a place called Barons Court in County Tyrone, but this was his last. This was his last. I have to knock off my phone, please. And he was commissioned then, and the work was supervised by William Shepherd. So here are some images from it. This is a map on the top left, and the waterfall and Pullum Rock work on the western side of the green are worth of a visit. Likewise, an ornamental lake provides a home for waterfowl. So it's a lovely little green, and it's very close to the city centre, and it's very well used. Lord Ardilaun later paid for the laying out of the green in its current form and gave it to the city, but then since then it was given to the nation. And then the city commissioned a statue of him, which you see on the left-hand side. Victoria Park in Belfast, remember this is the period of Queen Victoria. They decided to create a public park near the Conceptual River in East Belfast. Sorry, I see Elizabeth wrote a note here. There's a non-dial IFLA Congress in Turin. That's true, yes, an IFLA Congress. Thank you, Elizabeth. I didn't notice that comment until now. If anyone wants to go to that, true. The progress was slow, but the land was very marshy, inaccessible to the public, and generally unsuitable. But anyway, they did develop a park here, opened in 1906, landscaped by Charles McKim, who also developed a nice tropical ravine. Nice park in Belfast. They don't allow any active football or recreation. It's mostly for walks. Now we're going to change from parks, and we're going to talk about the Garden City movement. And this started with this man, Sir Ebenezer Howard, who died in 1928. And he was looking at the overcrowded, insanitary conditions of 19th century life. And he wrote a book called A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, and that was published in 1898. And from that led the Garden City movement, where people could have the benefits of both town and country. And arising from that, they developed the first garden city at Letchworth. And Letchworth is just about less than a half hour's drive north of Stansted Airport at London. So it's not inaccessible if you're visiting London at any time. It's a nice place to go. It's an interesting historical place. And they also have a museum there to the memory of Sir Ebenezer Howard. Now we're back to France, Elizabeth, and this is the Parc de la Villette, which is a 20th century park, 55 hectares, the largest fully landscaped park in the city of Paris. It's a collection of, sorry, distracted by something there for a minute. It's a collection of architectural follies, themed gardens, and open spaces for exploration and activity, and to act as a means of deconstructing the traditional views of how a park is conventionally meant to exist. Elizabeth, what do you think of Parc de la Villette? I'd be interested in your view on this. I presume you have been there. It's a place that the follies were interesting. Okay. Well, it's to show you how things are. If you could imagine us walking around with skeletons and no bodies covering skeletons, that's deconstruction is the whole emphasis of this park. But there's indoor facilities there as well. It's very non-traditional. And you can see them red, yes. Another park that's a more modern park, 1992, 14 hectares, it's also in Paris, is Parc André Citroën. And this was designed by Giles Clement and Alan Provost. And it's the site of the former Citroën plant, remember the Citroën cars, and named after the company founder. It's a rectangular lawn, with the lawn's in the centre of roughly 273 by 85 metres. It's got two greenhouse pavilions, and there's a 630 metre diagonal path which goes through the park, and every so long you go, the scene changes. Rather than putting a park around on the outside and so on, this is a park going diagonally. Now there are perimeter paths as well, but this is to show you the contrast between one side and another. We'll see what Elizabeth has to say that. And a lot of different gardens, designs by different designers. Correct, indeed, yes. Now we move back to the UK. One of the more modern parks in the UK is the Thames Barrier Park in London. And this also had Alan Provost as a designer. A city like London is situated on the River Thames, and when you have problems of flooding, it's a city that has to worry about that. So they built these barriers, which are very successful, and I can't tell you I know how to work, but alongside it they built this Thames Barrier Park, and it was developed by the London Development Corporation. And there's 22 acres of lawns, trees, and uniquely contoured view. Now I haven't been there, so I have only these images to play with. So a children's play area, five-a-side football, a Thames path with magnificent views, a fountain plaza, and again Alan Provost was used in this design. And again in the UK I would advise that you go to this place, the Eden Project, which is down in Cornwall, and this was a project from the Millennium period. Remember that time when we all crossed from 1999 to 2000? Each country had their own Millennium Project. Well, this was Tim Smith, who's involved with music production in the UK. He developed this project down in Cornwall, which is down near the very tip of Cornwall. And while there was more projects in London where the population was greater, this is the most successful Millennium Project. It's actually an environmental education centre. It's like going for a parks visit or a garden visit, but this is all about the environment, and it's got 1 million visitors per year. Lynn, I have 12, I'm only going to 86, so I have 8 more slides. Sorry about that. We'll be soon finishing. Father Collins Park is in Dublin. This is a very modern park, and this cost 20 million euros. The city built this park on the hope that the housing would pay for it, but we got a recession in 2008, and it may be some time before the city gets its money. Designed by a landscape architect from Argentina, but it's fantastic modern park, very, very modern park from anything elsewhere in Dublin. A little finishing off here, the small inner city parks are something we must consider. And in 1879, the new gardens, formerly St. Paul's Cathedral Graveyard, were opened. So this is the beginning of using graveyards and making small parks of them. And in 1880 onwards, the movement to create small, more accessible inner city parks began, because small spaces were disappearing as towns expanded. But they had to get a legislation to give powers to close churchyards, but they fell into disrepair. So in 1881 there was an Open Spaces Act, and in 1884 disused Burials Ground Act, which gave local authorities powers to convert them into gardens and recreation grounds. Then we have Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, a very famous cemetery in the world, and in 1804 it was initiated, and it's one of the most famous cemeteries. It's 300,000 remains buried or cremated there, but that's actually not so many as far as I can figure out, because we have a cemetery in Dublin with over 1.5 million
let you know about the continuing education.
There's many famous people there, Edith Piaf, Oscar Wilde, and Maria Callas. And the layout and the monuments inspired designs of cemeteries elsewhere. And it's now a tourist attraction when you go to Paris, and you've seen all the other things that are to be seen. And we'll see what Elizabeth has to say about that. Come to Dublin to see a bigger cemetery, but inspired by Père Lachaise. It's Glasnevin, and its first burials were 1832. One of the first walks created in Paris. Thank you. And now this has now museums and includes heritage trees and so on. And this is a very important cemetery for us here. But what I find interesting is to go and visit the war cemeteries. And again, the best ones that I know of are in France. And of course, where so much of the war happened, there's plenty of cemeteries from the First World War and the Second World War. The